June 6, 1944. While thousands of Allied soldiers waded through blood-stained surf at Normandy, a young American pilot named Thomas Fraser sat in the cockpit of his P-51B Mustang at an English airfield, running through his pre-flight checks. The propeller ticked over. The Packard-built Merlin engine hummed with that distinctive high-pitched whine. Everything looked good. Fraser pushed the throttle forward. The olive-drab fighter rolled down the runway and lifted into the morning sky at 9:40-7. He was heading to France, part of the massive aerial shield protecting the invasion below. Fraser had no idea that before the day ended, his aircraft would be sitting in German-occupied territory, or that within 72 hours, a Luftwaffe test pilot would be flying it over the Reich. What happened next would shatter everything German command thought they knew about the fighter that was bleeding them dry in the skies over Europe. Fraser's Mustang that morning was a beautiful machine. Sleek lines, 450 caliber machine guns, 1,490 horses of raw power driving a 3-bladed propeller. It was the best long-range fighter America had. Fast enough to chase down anything in the sky, agile enough to dogfight with the Luftwaffe's finest. And it had range, real range, the kind that let you escort bombers all the way to Berlin and still have fuel to fight your way home. But every thoroughbred has a weakness. Somewhere over northern France, at 12,000 feet, Fraser felt it. A shudder through the airframe. The Merlin's smooth roar turned rough. Oil pressure falling. Coolant temperature climbing. He knew what that meant. The Mustang's liquid-cooled engine was its greatest asset and its Achilles heel. All it took was one tiny puncture in those coolant lines. One fragment of flak, and you had maybe 10 minutes before the whole thing seized solid. Fraser keyed his radio. Told his flight leader he was breaking formation. Nobody argued. You don't stay in the air when your engine's cooking itself to death. He nosed down, searching the patchwork of French farmland below for something flat enough to land on. Enemy territory. German troops everywhere. But his options had just narrowed to one, there, a field. Looked clear enough. Fraser dropped his landing gear and flaps, brought the Mustang around in a gentle arc, and touched down on rough grass. The fighter bounced once, settled, and rolled to a stop. Engine still turning over. Barely. Fraser sat there for a moment in the sudden quiet, looking at the French countryside through his canopy. The airframe was intact. Propeller straight. Landing gear solid. Just an engine that wouldn't run anymore. He climbed out and started walking, trying to put distance between himself and the aircraft before the Germans showed up. He didn't make it far. Within hours, they found him. And within 6 hours, a German salvage team was loading his Mustang onto a flatbed trailer. These weren't amateurs. The Germans had this down to a science. Specialized recovery units called Bergungstruppen, whose entire job was grabbing down Allied aircraft before roaming fighters could turn them into scrap metal. They moved fast, drained the fuel, disconnected the battery, posted guards. By sunrise the next morning, Fraser's P-51B was on a train heading east into Germany. Destination: Rechlin. If you were a captured Allied aircraft in 1944, Rechlin was where you ended up. It sat about 60 miles northwest of Berlin in the remote countryside of Mecklenburg. The Luftwaffe's primary testing facility since 1936. Every new German design went through Rechlin. Every captured enemy bird that could still fly wound up there too. Miles of runways. Hangars packed with experimental aircraft. Workshops staffed with mechanics who could make anything flyable. And a cadre of test pilots who'd flown everything from gliders to the newest jet fighters. One of those pilots was about to change the war. His name was Hans-Werner Lerche. 30 years old. Engineering degree. One of the best pilots in Germany. maybe the best. Lerche had learned to fly gliders as a teenager, earned his powered license in the 30s, and joined the Luftwaffe when the shooting started. But they never sent him to combat. He was too valuable. His job was to fly anything they gave him and write detailed reports about how it performed. By June of '44, Lerche had logged flight time in over 120 different aircraft types. German fighters, Italian bombers, captured Soviet Yaks, British Spitfires and Lancasters, American P-38s and P-47s. He could climb into an unfamiliar cockpit without a manual, without a checklist, and figure it out. Engineering knowledge and pilot instinct. And in all those flights, across all those aircraft, he'd never crashed once. That record was remarkable considering he was flying enemy machines with no instruction books, no training. Just educated guesses about where the controls were and how the systems worked. When Fraser's Mustang arrived at Rechlin on June 8th, Lerche was told to have it ready to fly within 2 days. That was fast. Unusually fast. Normally captured aircraft sat for weeks while mechanics went over every system, checking for sabotage, repairing damage, puzzling out how everything worked. But the Luftwaffe was desperate for information about the P-51. The Mustang had only appeared over Germany in large numbers 6 months earlier. Before December of '43, American bombers flew with P-38s and P-47s. Good aircraft, but limited range. Deep inside Germany, those bombers were vulnerable. Luftwaffe fighters had been killing them by the dozens. Then the Mustang showed up. Suddenly American. Bombers had an escort that could go anywhere they went. Berlin, Munich, even targets deep in Poland. The Mustang could fly 900 miles on internal fuel, 1,500 with drop tanks. It was fast. 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It could climb to 42,000. It could turn with a Messerschmitt 109, dive away from a Focke-Wulf 190, and it had 450 caliber machine guns that could rip a German fighter to pieces. In 6 months. The Mustang had changed everything. German pilots who'd owned the skies in '43 were suddenly defensive. Kill ratios were reversing. And nobody in German command fully understood why this one, American fighter was so much better than everything else the Allies flew. That's why Lerche only had 2 days. They needed answers. The mechanics at Rechlin worked around the clock. They pulled the engine, found the coolant leak that had forced Fraser down, and fixed it. They inspected every system, every control surface, every fuel line, every hydraulic connection. They painted the undersides and tail bright yellow so German anti-aircraft gunners wouldn't shoot it down. Standard color for captured aircraft at Rechlin. They painted large black crosses on the wings and fuselage. They gave it a German designation, T9 plus HK. They filled the tanks with high-octane American fuel from captured stocks. By the morning of June 10th, the Mustang was ready. Lerche walked out to the aircraft at 8 in the morning. He'd reviewed every piece of intelligence the Luftwaffe had on the P-51, combat reports from pilots who'd fought against them, technical drawings from downed aircraft, performance estimates based on combat observations. But all of that was secondhand. Lerche was about to get the truth firsthand. He was about to find out if the P-51 Mustang was really as good as the Americans claimed, or if it was just another overrated fighter that looked better on paper than in the air. The walk-around took 20 minutes. The airframe looked well-built. Smooth skin, flush rivets, clean lines. The wings were thin, much thinner than a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. Lerche recognized the laminar flow airfoil design. Lower drag at high speeds. Smart engineering. The cockpit was spacious compared to German fighters. The canopy gave good visibility, though not as good as the bubble canopy models he'd seen in intelligence photos. The controls looked straightforward: stick, rudder pedals, Throttle, mixture control. Propeller pitch. The instrument panel was laid out logically, though everything was in English and used American units. Airspeed in miles per hour instead of kilometers. Altitude in feet instead of meters. Lerche climbed in. The seat fit well. The stick fell naturally to hand. He checked the control surfaces. Ailerons moved smoothly. Elevator responded correctly. Rudder had good travel. He found the fuel selector, the gear lever, the flap control. He found the gun switches and made sure they were off. Last thing he needed was to accidentally fire 450 caliber machine guns on the ground at Rechlin. He checked the engine instruments. Oil pressure gauge, oil temperature, coolant temperature, manifold pressure, tachometer, everything an American pilot needed to keep the Merlin alive. Lerche knew the Merlin was a high-performance engine, but it was also sensitive. Too much throttle too fast and it would stumble. Too lean on the mixture and it would overheat. German engines were more forgiving. The Daimler-Benz in the Bf-109 could take abuse. The BMW 801 in the FW-190 was practically indestructible. But the Merlin was a thoroughbred. And thoroughbreds needed careful handling. At 8:42, Lerche signaled the ground crew. They pulled the wheel chocks. He engaged the starter. The Merlin turned over, caught, settled into a rough idle. He let it warm up, watching the oil temperature climb slowly. The engine sounded different from German engines. Higher pitched, smoother. When the temperatures were normal, Lerche tested the magnetos. Both checked good. He advanced the throttle slightly. Felt the aircraft strain against the brakes. He released them and began taxiing. The Mustang's tailwheel wasn't steerable like some German aircraft. You had to use differential braking and rudder to control direction on the ground. Lerche had experience with that from flying captured British planes. He taxied to the runway, ran through a final check, and looked down the long concrete strip. No wind. Clear sky. Perfect conditions. He advanced the throttle smoothly, keeping his feet on the rudder pedals to hold the nose straight. The Merlin responded instantly. The Mustang accelerated fast. Faster than a Bf-109. Faster than most German fighters Lerche had flown. The tail came up at 40 miles per hour. At 90, the aircraft lifted off smoothly. Gear up. The Mustang climbed away from Rechlin at a steep angle. The Merlin pulling strong at full power. Lerche leveled off at 5,000 feet and began his evaluation. The first thing that struck him was how light the controls were. The stick required almost no force to move. A tiny input produced an immediate response. The ailerons were incredibly effective. Lerche rolled the Mustang left, then right. The aircraft snapped through the rolls faster than any fighter he'd ever flown. In a Bf-109, you had to muscle the stick to get a fast roll rate. In the FW-190, the controls got heavy at high speed. But the Mustang rolled effortlessly, almost too easily. Lerche had to be careful not to over-control. He checked the rudder. Responsive, but not overly sensitive. The elevator was light, but effective. The Mustang was stable in pitch. Didn't try to nose over or climb on its own. He tried a loop. The aircraft pulled through cleanly. No tendency to stall. No buffeting. Just smooth acceleration through the maneuver. He tried a barrel roll. Perfect. He tried a climbing turn. Pulling 4 Gs. The Mustang stayed smooth. No shaking. No warning signs of a stall. Lerche pushed the throttle to full power and accelerated in level flight. 160 miles per hour. 200. 250. 300. The Mustang was still accelerating. At 320, he leveled off and noted the Merlin's manifold pressure and RPM. The engine was running smooth. Temperatures normal. He had more power available if he needed it. German intelligence had estimated the Mustang's top speed at 410 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Lerche wanted to test that himself. He climbed to 23,000, leveled off, and pushed the throttle to maximum continuous power. The Mustang accelerated. 360, 380, 400, 410, 416 miles per hour at 23,000 feet. German estimates had been close, but slightly low. The Mustang was even faster than intelligence thought. Lerche reduced power and tried different configurations. Flaps down, gear down, simulating a landing approach. The Mustang slowed smoothly. No bad habits. Gear up, flaps up. Back to high-speed flight. He tested the stall characteristics. Clean configuration first. Power off, nose up, reducing speed gradually. The Mustang gave plenty of warning before the stall. The controls got mushy. The aircraft started to buffet. Then the nose dropped gently. No wing drop. No snap roll. Just a docile stall that was easy to recover. He tried it with landing configuration. Gear down, flaps down, power off. Same result. Good warning. Gentle brake. Easy recovery. He tried it with power on, simulating a combat turn. At full throttle, the Mustang would stall in a sharp turn if you pulled too hard. But it gave clear warning through stick force and buffet. Lerche noted that the P-51 was actually easier to fly near the stall than most German fighters. The Bf-109 would snap into a spin if you stalled it in a turn. The FW-190 would drop a wing violently. The Mustang just mushed. Gave you time to recognize the problem and recover smoothly when you relax the back pressure. That was important in combat. A fighter that could be flown aggressively without killing the pilot was a deadly weapon. Lerche spent an hour putting the Mustang through every maneuver he could think of. Vertical climbs, split SS, chandelles, Immelmann turns, scissors maneuvers. The aircraft responded instantly to every input. It never did anything unexpected. It never tried to kill him. When he landed back at Rechlin at 10:15, the ground crew was waiting. They wanted to know what he thought. Lerche shut down the Merlin, climbed out of the cockpit, and spoke 5 words that would appear in his official report the next day. It is a truly unique aircraft. Over the next 2 days, Lerche flew Fraser's Mustang 4 more times. He tested high-altitude performance, reaching 36,000 feet. He tested dive performance, pushing past 450 miles per hour in a steep dive. He tested fuel consumption, endurance, engine handling, control response at different speeds and altitudes. He compared the Mustang's performance to the latest German fighters, the Bf-109, G-10 and the FW-190D-9. His conclusion was clear. Only those 2 German aircraft could match the Mustang in combat. And even they weren't clearly superior. The Mustang was fast at all altitudes, climbed well, turned tightly, dove like a rocket, and had enough fuel to stay in a fight for hours. Lerche also noted the weaknesses. The engine was sensitive to rough handling. The fuel system caused stability problems if the internal fuselage tank was filled to certain levels. The aircraft could stall at full throttle if pulled into too sharp a turn. But these were minor issues compared to the overall performance. Lerche's report was typed up, classified, and distributed to Luftwaffe Command. 1 copy went to fighter units defending Germany. The message was clear. The P-51 Mustang was the best Allied fighter in the sky. Don't underestimate it. Don't assume your Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf is automatically superior. The Mustang can beat you in a turning fight, can outrun you in level flight, can dive away from you if things get bad. The only advantages German fighters had were armament and experienced pilots. German 20mm and 30mm cannons hit harder than American .50 caliber machine guns. But by mid-1944, experienced German pilots were getting killed faster than they could be replaced. The Americans weren't the only ones who noticed something unusual. German fighter pilots started receiving information about the Mustang's capabilities. Information that contradicted what they'd been told before. At JG-1, a fighter wing defending northern Germany, pilots gathered in a briefing room to watch a demonstration. Outside on the airfield, several captured Allied aircraft had landed. P-38s, P-47s, a Spitfire, and a Mustang with German markings. The unit touring these airfields was called Wanderzirkus Rosarius, the Rosarius Traveling Circus, named after Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, who commanded an experimental unit of the Luftwaffe High Command. Rosarius's job was to familiarize German pilots with Allied aircraft so they would understand their opponent's strengths and weaknesses. The briefing officer stood in front of the room and spoke carefully. "You have been told that the Bf-109 and the FW-190 are superior to American fighters. In some respects, this is true. But the P-51 Mustang is different. You will see it demonstrated today. Pay attention to its roll rate, its acceleration, its turning performance. It is faster than you expect. It can turn tighter than you have been taught. And it has the range to follow you home if you try to disengage." Some of the pilots shifted uncomfortably. They'd been in combat against Mustangs. They knew what the briefing officer was saying was true, but officially admitting it was different. After the briefing, the pilots walked out to the flight line. The Mustang with T9 markings was parked next to a Bf-109 and a FW-190. German pilots climbed into the cockpits, examined the controls, looked at the gun sight, felt the stick response. Then the demonstration flight began. 2 German pilots took off in the Bf-109 and the FW-190. A third pilot, an experienced test pilot from Rosarius's unit, took off in the Mustang. The 3 aircraft climbed to 10,000 feet, circled the airfield, and began a simulated dogfight. The pilots on the ground watched carefully. They saw the Mustang stay with the Bf-109 through hard turns. They saw it roll faster than the FW-190. They saw it accelerate away from both German fighters in level flight. They saw it climb at the same rate, dive faster, maneuver with confidence. When the 3 aircraft landed, the German pilots who'd been watching were quiet. That demonstration summarized the problem the Luftwaffe faced. For years, German pilots had been told their aircraft were the best in the world. In 1940, 41, 42, that was mostly true. But by 44, the Americans had caught up. And in some cases, they'd pulled ahead. The Mustang was the proof. German pilots who'd spent 3 years controlling the air war suddenly found themselves reacting to American initiative. American pilots called it energy fighting. The Mustang had so much power and such good acceleration that it could dictate the terms of combat. If a Mustang pilot wanted to fight, he could close in and force an engagement. If he wanted to disengage, he could dive away or outrun you in level flight. That psychological shift was as important as the technical performance. By August of 44, Lerche's report on Fraser's Mustang had been distributed throughout the Luftwaffe. Fighter units received copies. Training squadrons received copies. Engineering teams received copies. The report was detailed, technical, and honest. It didn't sugarcoat the Mustang's performance. It didn't claim German superiority out of propaganda necessity. It simply stated the facts. The P-51 Mustang was an excellent fighter aircraft. It had exceptional range. It had high speed at all altitudes. It had good maneuverability. It had effective armament. And most importantly, it was being produced in massive numbers. The Americans could afford to lose Mustangs and replace them within weeks. Germany could not afford to lose experienced pilots. By late 44, the Luftwaffe was running out of experienced pilots faster than the training schools could produce new ones. Young pilots with 50 hours of flight time were being thrown into combat against American pilots with 200 hours of training and 50 combat missions. The result was predictable. German pilots died. American pilots racked up kills. One of the most dramatic examples of this came in March of 1945. By then, the war was almost over. Germany was being overrun from the east by Soviet forces and from the west by American and British forces. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. Most of its experienced pilots were dead or captured. Most of its aircraft had been destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks. Fuel was so scarce that many remaining aircraft couldn't fly. In early March of 45, American intelligence officers began interrogating captured German pilots. They wanted to know what the Germans thought of American aircraft. 22 captured Luftwaffe pilots, many of them experienced aces, were interviewed. The interrogations were compiled into a classified document called the Air Intelligence Weekly Summary, dated March 23, 1940-5. The section titled Allied Fighters as Germans See Them contained detailed opinions from men who'd fought against P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. The results were unambiguous. The captured German pilots rated the P-51 Mustang as the best fighter in the American arsenal. They respected its speed, range, and agility. Some admitted they would only try to outrun it if they had a serious head start. Others said that only the most skilled German pilots dared to engage a Mustang in a turning fight, because the Mustang's agility was difficult to counter. One experienced pilot was quoted as noting that American .50 caliber machine guns were highly effective against fighters, especially because they offered high volume of fire with deadly accuracy. The Luftwaffe had spent 2 years developing tactics to defeat American bombers and fighters. Those tactics had worked against the P-38 and the P-47, but they didn't work as well against the Mustang. The Mustang was too fast, too maneuverable, too much endurance. By the time these interrogations were conducted, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe had been defeated. Allied air forces controlled the skies over Germany completely. German pilots who managed to take off faced overwhelming odds. 5-1, 10-1, sometimes 20-1. And many of those Allied fighters were Mustangs. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war. After Germany surrendered in May of 45, he was captured by American forces. They recognized his value as a test pilot and his knowledge of German aircraft development. He was interrogated extensively about the aircraft he'd flown and the reports he'd written. The Americans wanted to know what Lerche thought of their aircraft, especially the P-51. Lerche told them the truth. The Mustang was one of the best aircraft he'd ever flown. It had a combination of speed, range, and maneuverability that few fighters could match. It was well engineered, well built, deadly in combat. The Americans took notes. After the war, Lerche returned to civilian life in Germany. He worked as an engineer and occasionally as a test pilot for German aviation companies. In 1980, he published a book titled Luftwaffe Test Pilot: Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II. The book was based on his wartime logbooks and contained detailed descriptions of every aircraft he'd flown. Chapter on the P-51 Mustang was one of the longest. Lerche described Fraser's aircraft in detail, talked about the test flights at Rechlin, gave his honest assessment of its performance. He never saw the P-51 as an enemy aircraft. To Lerche, it was simply a well-designed machine. As an engineer and a pilot, he appreciated good design regardless of which country produced it. Lerche died in 1994 at age 80. His book remains one of the most detailed accounts of Luftwaffe aircraft testing during World War Lieutenant Thomas Fraser, the pilot who force-landed that Mustang in northern France, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Germany. He was captured on June 6, 1944. The same day the Allies landed at Normandy. He was liberated in May of '45 by advancing American forces and returned to the United States that summer. He never knew what happened to his aircraft until years later, when researchers tracked down the story through German records. Fraser learned that his P-51, the one nicknamed Jerry, had been tested by one of Germany's best pilots, had been flown by the Rosarius Circus to multiple Luftwaffe bases, had been used to train German pilots on how to fight against Mustangs. The aircraft, designated T-9HK, was lost on December 10, 1940-4. Fraser, single quotes, S service record, listed one aircraft lost to mechanical failure over enemy territory on June 6, 1944. It didn't mention that his aircraft became one of the most important intelligence sources the Luftwaffe had on the P-51 Mustang. P-51 Mustang changed the air war over Europe in ways that went beyond simple performance numbers. It wasn't just fast or maneuverable or long-ranged. It was all of those things combined in one aircraft. It was produced in massive numbers. Over 15,000 Mustangs were built during the war. It was reliable enough to fly deep into enemy territory and return home. It was versatile enough to escort bombers, strafe ground targets, and dogfight with enemy fighters. And it was available at exactly the moment the Allies needed it most. The Mustang's origins made its success even more remarkable. North American Aviation designed and built the prototype in just 102 days in 1940. The British had approached the company asking them to build P-40 Warhawks under license. Instead, the president of North American Aviation, James Kindleberger, proposed building an entirely new fighter from scratch, under the direction of chief designer Edgar Schmude. The British agreed. The first prototype, called the NA-73X, flew on October 26, 1940. Just 149 days after the contract was signed. That development timeline was unprecedented. Most fighter aircraft took years to design, test, and bring into production. North American did it in less than 5 months. But the early Mustangs had a problem. They were powered by Allison engines that performed well at low altitude, but lost power above 15,000 feet. The aircraft was fast at sea level, over 400 miles per hour in some tests. But at 20,000 feet, where most combat over Europe took place, the Allison-powered Mustang could barely reach 350. That made it useless as a bomber escort. The Royal Air Force used early Mustangs for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions. American forces sent Allison-powered Mustangs to North Africa and the China-Burma-India theater, where combat happened closer to the ground. Then, in late 1942, someone had an idea that changed everything. Ronald Harker, a test pilot at Rolls-Royce, SUGGESTE, fitting a Mustang with a Merlin 61 engine. The Merlin had a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power at high altitude. Rolls-Royce installed Merlin engines in 5 test Mustangs. The results were astonishing. The Merlin Mustang could reach speeds over 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. It could climb to 40,000. It had all the range and low-drag characteristics of the original design. But now it had high-altitude performance that matched or exceeded any fighter in the world. An American military attaché in London, a man named Tommy Hitchcock, saw the test results and immediately sent a report to Washington. Hitchcock had been a fighter pilot in World War I, had been shot down and captured by the Germans, had escaped from a prisoner of war camp. After the war, he'd become one of America's most famous polo players. He understood both aviation and how to get things done through military Bureaucracy. His report on the Merlin Mustang emphasized that this was the long-range escort fighter America needed for the bombing campaign against Germany. The Army Air Forces authorized North American to begin production of Merlin-powered Mustangs immediately. Packard Motor Company in Detroit was already producing Merlin engines under license from Rolls-Royce. North American installed Packard Merlins in Mustang airframes and created the P-51B model. Production began in mid-1943. By December of that year, the first Merlin Mustangs reached England. The 354th Fighter Group, flying P-51Bs, began escort missions over Germany in December of 40-3. Within weeks, it was clear the Mustang had changed everything. American bombers that had been suffering losses of 8 to 10% per mission suddenly saw losses drop to 3 to 4%. German fighters that had been attacking bomber formations with impunity suddenly faced long-range escorts that could follow them home. Luftwaffe pilots who'd controlled German airspace for 4 years suddenly found themselves on the defensive. The P-51D model, which entered service in mid-44, was even better. It had a bubble canopy that gave the pilot 360 visibility. It had 650 caliber machine guns instead of 4. It had improved ammunition feed systems that reduced jamming. It had provisions for mounting rockets or bombs under the wings for ground attack missions. And it had additional internal fuel capacity that extended its already impressive range. A P-51D with drop tanks could fly 1,700 miles, stay in combat for 30 minutes, and return to base with fuel to spare. No other single-engine fighter in World War II could match that endurance. The strategic impact was enormous. Before the Mustang, American daylight bombing raids were limited to targets within range of shorter-legged escort fighters. That meant targets in France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Berlin, the industrial centers in central Germany, and oil refineries in Poland were beyond reach. German factories could be relocated east, beyond the range of American escorts, and continue producing aircraft and weapons. But when the Mustang arrived, nowhere in Germany was safe. Bombers could hit targets anywhere, and Mustangs would protect them. German industrial capacity, which had been dispersed to avoid bombing, was suddenly vulnerable again. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, chemical works, transportation hubs, all were within range of American bombers protected by Mustang escorts. In late 43 and early 44, the Allied bombing campaign against Germany was suffering terrible losses. Bombers were being shot down by the hundreds. Crews were dying. The campaign was on the verge of being suspended. Then the Mustang arrived in large numbers. Suddenly, bombers had protection all the way to Berlin and back. Suddenly, German fighters couldn't attack bomber formations without facing swarms of long-range American escorts. Suddenly, Luftwaffe pilots who took off to intercept bombers found themselves being hunted by Mustangs waiting above the formations. The air war shifted. In February of 44, General Jimmy Doolittle made a decision that changed American fighter tactics. Doolittle had just taken command of the 8th Air Force in England. Before his arrival, American fighters were required to stay close to the bomber formations at all times. If enemy fighters attacked, American fighters would drive them away and then return to close escort. This defensive tactic protected bombers but allowed German fighters to escape an attack. Again later, Doolittle changed the rules. He told his fighter pilots to go after German fighters aggressively. If enemy aircraft were spotted, American fighters should pursue them wherever they went. Shoot them down. Destroy them on the ground if possible. The goal wasn't just to protect bombers. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. This change in tactics, combined with the Mustang's long range and high performance, was devastating to German fighter forces. American pilots could now hunt German fighters across all of Germany. If a Luftwaffe pilot took off to intercept bombers, Mustangs would chase him. If he tried to land, Mustangs would follow him to his airfield and shoot him down during landing approach. If he managed to land safely, Mustangs would strafe his aircraft on the ground. German pilots called this tactic free jad, free hunting. American pilots called it fighter sweeps. Whatever the name, it was deadly effective. One example of this came in January of '44. Major James Howard, flying a P-51B with the 356th Fighter Squadron of the 354th Fighter Group, was escorting B-17 bombers to a target near Oschersleben in Germany. Howard's squadron got separated from the bombers during the mission. Howard found himself alone with 60 B-17s under attack by 30 German fighters. Instead of retreating, Howard attacked. For 30 minutes, he fought alone against multiple German fighters. He shot down several aircraft, damaged others, drove the rest away from the bombers. His guns jammed, but he continued making fake attacks to keep German fighters away from the formation. Not a single bomber from that group was lost. Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive that decoration. His action on January 11, 1944, showed what a single Mustang pilot could accomplish with skill and determination. But Howard's success wasn't just individual heroism. It was possible because he flew an aircraft that could stay with the bombers for hours, could fight at high altitude, could outmaneuver German fighters, had enough ammunition to engage multiple targets that no other fighter in early '44 could have done what Howard did that day. By mid-'44, the Luftwaffe was losing the battle. During Big Week, a concentrated bombing campaign in February of '44, Mustang pilots destroyed a significant percentage of Germany's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. Those weren't just aircraft lost. Those were trained, experienced pilots killed or captured. Pilots who could never be replaced. Germany was producing plenty of fighter aircraft. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were rolling off production lines by the hundreds. But Germany couldn't produce trained pilots fast enough to fill the cockpits. By late '44, many German pilots had less than 100 hours of total flight time when they entered combat. Some had as little as 50 hours. American pilots, by comparison, typically had over 200 hours of training before reaching Europe. And many veteran pilots had flown 50 or more combat missions. The experience gap was enormous. An inexperienced German pilot in a good aircraft couldn't beat an experienced American pilot in an excellent aircraft. The result was predictable. German pilots died in huge numbers. Kill ratios that had favored the Luftwaffe early in the war reversed completely. By '45, American pilots were achieving kills at ratios of 5-to-1, 10-to-1, sometimes higher. And the P-51 Mustang was responsible for more of those kills than any other Allied fighter. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was defeated, and the P-51 Mustang played a larger role in that defeat than any other Allied fighter. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was interviewed after Germany's surrender. American intelligence officers asked him when he knew Germany had lost the war. Göring's answer was direct. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." That statement summarized the strategic impact of the P-51. When long-range, American fighters could penetrate to the heart of Germany. When they could escort bombers anywhere and hunt German fighters everywhere, the Luftwaffe could no longer defend German airspace. And without control of the air, Germany couldn't win the war. What the Germans discovered when they tested Fraser's Mustang wasn't a secret weakness they could exploit. It was confirmation of what they already suspected. The P-51 was everything American pilots claimed it was: fast, agile, incredible range. Could be flown aggressively without killing the pilot. Well armed. And the Americans had thousands of them. German engineers, could study the laminar flow wing, the efficient cooling system, the Packard Merlin engine. They could measure the performance, calculate the drag coefficient, analyze the control system. But they couldn't build enough aircraft to match American production. They couldn't train enough pilots to replace combat losses. They couldn't produce enough fuel to keep their remaining fighters in the air. By the time Lerche flew Fraser's Mustang, Germany had already lost the air war. The test flight at Rechlin just confirmed what German command already knew. The Americans had a fighter that could go anywhere, do anything, and win the battle. And there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to stop it. That's how technological superiority actually works in war. Not through propaganda claims or exaggerated performance numbers, but through engineering excellence that produces measurable results. The P-51 Mustang wasn't perfect. It had weaknesses. The liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable to battle damage. The fuel system became unstable when the fuselage tank was full. The controls required careful handling at high speeds, but its combination of speed, range, maneuverability, and reliability made it the most effective long-range fighter of World War II. Even German test pilots who flew it came to that conclusion. Even German intelligence officers who analyzed it admitted its superiority. And when the war ended, the Mustang's record spoke for itself. P-51 pilots destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. They escorted bombers deep into Germany and brought them home safely. They dominated the skies over Europe in the final year of the war. Not because American pilots were always better trained, though many were. Not because American tactics were always superior, though they often were. But because they flew an aircraft that gave them every possible advantage. The Germans learned that lesson the hard way. By testing captured P-51s, by flying them in mock combat, by analyzing their performance in detail. And what they learned was that sometimes the other side builds something you can't beat. Something you can only respect. Something that changes the outcome of the war. The P-51 Mustang was that aircraft. And even its enemies knew it. On June 6, 1944, while the fate of the free world hung in the balance on the beaches of Normandy, Thomas Fraser climbed into his Mustang and took off into history. He didn't know his forced landing would hand the Luftwaffe one of their most important intelligence finds of the war. He didn't know a German test pilot would push his aircraft to its limits and come away shaken by what he'd discovered. He didn't know his P-51 would tour German air bases, showing enemy pilots exactly what they were up against. All Fraser knew was that his engine was dying, and he needed to find a place to land. The rest became history. The kind of history that's written not in conference rooms or on paper, but in the sky. At altitude, where the only thing that matters is whether your aircraft can do what you need it to do. When your life depends on it, the Mustang could, and that made all the difference.